Alright YouTube, there's a link in the description to a video uploaded by the Temple Institute. The Temple Institute, just for starters here, is a group of religious Judaists in Israel that seek to rebuild the third Temple of Jerusalem after 2 times being destroyed. Of course, people have tried to rebuild the temple before. They always got screwed up somehow. There were tales about the mountain, the old city, the actual rocks it's built on, spitting out fire and causing various death and destruction. The Orthodox Christians claim there actually is a sort of cavern in that location that spits out fire. However, the Temple Institute has made a stunning announcement, and it's done this twice before, so don't get your hopes up if you're waiting for the end times. They've announced that the 10th red heifer has been found. The red heifer has enormous significance within Judaism. Now, the Temple Institute represents the view, and there are 2 views within religious Judaism on the subject. They represent the view that Jews will rebuild the temple. The other side represents the view that the temple has to be rebuilt by divine hands. The former group then usually counters by saying that anyone who makes this particular sacrifice at the Temple Mount and begins to attempt to rebuild the temple is technically the Messiah of the Jews. The Messiah that they're waiting for supposedly will either give the offering and or oversee the reconstruction of the temple. Whether or not this individual is sent down through divine means, at least the majority of Judaists would consider them to be the Messiah. And the red heifer has a lot of laws surrounding it. And this is going to be quite a lengthy explanation of both this and attached topics. The red heifer sort of laws. The heifer has to have 1 hair color. There's a range of colors from a sort of smoky reddish color to a more earthy brown, but essentially it is red, and the video depicts this particular heifer that they have identified as their possible sacrifice. It has to be a coat of a single color, not even 2 hairs can be white or black or anything, it has to all be red. It can't do any work. You can't put a rope on it and lead it around. You can't feed it anything that's not kosher. It's free range, organic, no brands, no marks, no spots, no physical signs of illness. It can't do any work. It can't be yoked. It can't pull a wagon. It can't do anything. It just sits in the pasture until its 3rd year. Then it is sacrificed in a specific manner, burned to ash. The ash is mixed with water from a particular spring in Israel, which is heavily guarded. And then this ash and water mixture alone is used to anoint people that are entering the temple area, the Jews that are going there, to anoint the ground, to make it pure and holy, to allow for the rebuilding of the temple. The Jewish prophecies predict that when the 10th heifer is offered, that will correspond with the rebuilding of the temple and the return of the coming of the Jewish Messiah, who will lead them out of their curses, who will lead them into essentially eternal mastery over the entire earth. And some of the Zionist materials mentioned that after this happens, that every Jew will have 1,000 slaves, that they will rule the world, that all the non-Jews will sort of be, relegated to 2nd-class status, that Israel will become, through mystic means invincible, that they will be blessed continually, extraordinarily rich, that death will pass away, and that everything will be hunky-dory. But that's not the problem. If you're Jewish, then this offering is a very good thing. Almost. There's a problem, though. The figure that would be identified by the Jews as the Messiah would be identified potentially as the Messiah by some Christians, but other Christians would consider it the Antichrist. The Orthodoxy has already said that the temple will not be rebuilt until the end times, and that the Antichrist will be the one doing it. Within certain Protestant traditions, although the Jews are seen as the chosen people, the rebuilding of the temple, the offering of this particular cow, and the rebuilding of that temple corresponds to the beginning of the end times, to the beginning of persecution of Christians. There's another problem, because Well, actually, there's two problems when you figure Islam in. The first is that this location is already occupied by a mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which means that potentially, depending on where they figure the temple should be located, it has to be on a specific spot and a very, very specific design. The dimensions have to be perfect, the materials have to be perfect, everything has to be perfect. It might require the bulldozing and removal of one or both of the mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque, I believe it's called, although I may be getting my mosques wrong, my place marks wrong, and the Dome of the Rock, both of which date back centuries and have great religious significance to Islamists and great historical significance as structures within Jerusalem itself. And that's sure to piss off Muslims if they attempt to do that. There's another problem, though, an even worse problem, and that's that some of the religious Islamic groups have what's called Dajjal. Now, Dajjal is slightly equitable to the Christian version of the Antichrist. Not completely, because they don't believe that Jesus was a Christ, they call him a prophet. They don't believe in a messianic figure. What they do believe, though, is that at some time in the future, and it will be in this region as well, that a person will come forth and spread chaos and warmongering and attempt to destroy Islam and attempt to destroy the world, essentially, leading everyone into eternal darkness. This person is called Dajjal. They've made various claims to who Dajjal is, just like the Christians used to call, like, Reagan was the Antichrist, Bush, Obama. Various popes have been called the Antichrist, Osama bin Laden, Vladimir Putin. The Christians have a tendency to basically label anyone in a position of power they don't like a potential Antichrist. The Muslims have done the same with Dajjal at various times, but Dajjal is, if you read the books literally that refer to this character, is supposed to have a sort of injury to his face or eye, it's not exactly clear, which causes one of the eyes to bulge out and either is blind or turns purple like a grape or in general is fucked up somehow. So, you know, if any people with grievous head injuries start rebuilding the temple at Jerusalem, all hell will break loose. Now, the problem for me, I don't believe in the Jewish prophecies for the most part. I believe some of them are symbolic and thus essentially true because they refer retrospectively to past events. I don't believe in Jewish mysticism or Islamic theology or the end time stuff of the Christians. My take on Revelation, which is, by the way, the same as some Christians, is that the book of Revelation is a steganographic text that was written about the fall of Rome. Rome is Babylon. Nero is the beast 666. The prophecy was retrospectively fulfilled when Rome fell and only the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, were left, and that the millennial reign was, amusingly enough, the Dark Ages, when Christendom spread all across the globe, culminating in the Renaissance, at which point the end of the millennial reign came. There was more persecution also. The Inquisition did happen at that time, and then, of course, the church tempered that belief, and things generally got better from that point on because you have the arrival of sort of science and technology that goes beyond mere occult alchemy and so forth. So I believe that prophecy is not a prophecy but a steganographic writing that talks mostly about events concurrent to when it was written. However, I'm in the minority, because a lot of Muslims, a lot of Christians, and a lot of Jews believe that this has cosmic significance. And it doesn't help, by the way, that there exists the Kaduri prophecy. The Kaduri prophecy is taken very seriously by some religious Jews. Kaduri prophesied that shortly after Ariel Sharon kicked the bucket, which he now has, not very long ago, that the Messiah would appear very shortly. Kaduri claimed to have seen the actual Messiah of the Jews, and he was very well regarded as both a mystic and a prophet, as well as a healer, a religious leader in a general sense, and a social leader. He had an amazing amount of clout with a very large school of adherents to what he said. And the Muslims are waiting for this Dajjal. And you've got the Blood Moon Tetrad, which of course coincides during this period until 2015, which also has various significance both within Islam and Judaism, this blood moon cycle, and I won't get into that completely, but I'll mention it here, because it coincides with Passover and Sukkot roughly in the middle of these blood moon cycles. as well as I can't remember, a half eclipse or something like that right in the middle. So all the signs are there. Now, I don't look at these signs and say, oh, well, I guess the end is coming. Oh, Dajal's coming. Oh, the Messiah is here. Because I don't believe in Abrahamism. However, it's still troubling because if this heifer is offered and the temple begins to be rebuilt, it could potentially cause a grave deal of harm to that region of the world that's already unstable. The Jews, Christians, and Muslims already butcher one another repeatedly throughout history and always have, and it doesn't take much of a provocation to cause large amounts of bloodshed in the region. So imagine what would happen if hundreds of thousands or millions of religious Jews think the Messiah is there, and millions or tens of millions of Muslims think that it's Dajjal. And meanwhile, the evangelical Christians, especially in the U.S. and in other countries as well, especially Protestant countries, will believe that the end is coming. People could start acting in a very strange manner because to them, already you have people who do weird things because of their religion, because they think that the end time is nearly upon us. This would be far more convincing to them, especially to the Jews, which are normally fairly reserved, and take great steps not to prejudge that some prophecy has come true. They tend to be different from the Christians and Muslims in that respect, especially from the Christians. If they become convinced that the Messiah has come, there's no telling what will be done in that region of the world, which is everything you're talking about: Egypt, Israel, Lebanon and Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all the way over to Pakistan, up into Turkey, maybe into the southern European. You're talking about essentially, possibly, the whole world being engulfed with this sort of religious fervor because people will think the end is upon us. The end of an age or the end of the world in a very literal sense, depending on who you ask. So my concern about the possibility of this heifer being actually offered as a sacrifice to Yahweh, although not to his wife Asherah, and to the same deity that the Muslims claim is Allah, but not his four celestial, solar wives. The concern that I have is simply that people who take these things seriously might act irrationally if the temple is rebuilt. And there are Jews that would likely try, at least, to stand in the way of such an offering being given and an attempt made at rebuilding the temple, because they believe that the new temple is supposed to be built specifically in a divine fashion. We're talking angels come out of the sky and start commanding people to build. Angels come out of the sky and build it themselves. God's hand comes out of the sky and says, "Thou shalt build temple." You're talking about something like that, but there are groups of religious Jews that believe that the Jews themselves will be led by a messianic figure who becomes apparent at the moment that they offer this cow. And whoever is essentially chosen to perform that offering of ash and water and to sprinkle it around this location and on the congregants gathered therein would become the Messiah of Israel. And there's some weird thing that I saw on the Temple Institute site about how the person actually making the offering becomes unclean by doing it, which is strange to me, but then they have another term that they have in Hebrew for laws that don't make rational sense and are simply statutes given by God that aren't supposed to make sense. There was another story about how a tunnel underneath the old city, supposedly people went in there and found the Ark of the Covenant, and then there was essentially a riot, and they sealed it up with concrete. So they might, blast that loose and try to find any box that happens to fit the description roughly, declare it the Ark of the Covenant, and start worshiping it. Religion can be harmless. I'm not bashing religion in a general sense. I'm not religious myself. Not all religious practices are inherently evil. They may be delusional in many cases, but they're not necessarily harmful. But when you get the three Abrahamic paths all looking at the same potential future event and saying, well, the end is here, Dajjal is here, the Messiah is here, the Antichrist is here, the end of an era is here, or whatever, it could start to perturb these groups into broader chaos and more infighting amongst themselves and amongst these other foreign groups to themselves. It could cause a very large amount of bloodshed. Now, the Temple Institute twice before has thought that it identified a perfectly kosher, acceptable red heifer. Both times they declared it so, and then later on they said that actually they were blemished and they weren't capable of being offered. This may just be a fundraising stunt, because the Temple Institute does fundraising to try to gather the materials needed. They've already got heaps and heaps of materials that would be necessary for the temple. They've got everything basically except for the heifer and the temple itself all ready to go. They've got a solid silver shovel specifically for removing the ashes from the fire, as their Torah commands. They've got everything that they need, except they need to rebuild the temple, and first, in order to do that, they have to give this offering before construction can begin. So if they then make this offering, there is nothing standing in their way of doing so, and there will be nothing standing in the way of a potential cataclysmic war between these three Abrahamic groups. Because remember, Pakistan is an Islamic state and has nuclear weapons. And there's India right next to them, which hates them and also has nuclear weapons. Some of these Islamic states, the Saudis probably have nuclear weapons. The Iranians might have some nuclear materials beyond what they declare. There are certainly lots of chemical and biological weapons floating around. And of course, the Israelis have an estimated roughly 100 relatively crude, but still they do exist, nuclear weapons that they could mount on planes or fire from primitive ICBMs and to populate most of the Middle East. You've got a very large amount of weaponry in this region. It's already a powder keg waiting to blow, and then the Temple Institute saying, we're going to rebuild the temple and we found the perfect cow. Now, if a blemish is found on the cow before its third year, then this is all meaningless because they won't be able to offer it. But they are constantly on the lookout for one. Now, they're very careful also, and this was not strange that they did so, of not saying where this cow was. They said it was in the United States, which is amusing. I thought, looking at the video and listening to the accents, and you can tell me if you agree, I thought Pennsylvania, or possibly parts of New York, outside of the city, of course. You wouldn't find any cows in New York City unless they're, dead and in a museum, mummified, or somewhere around that region. It looks too lush to be the West, which is repulsed by drought. It doesn't look anything like the Midwest, especially the upper Midwest. It doesn't look anything like the Deep South. I'm guessing somewhere in the Mid-Atlantic would probably be where this cow is located. I may be completely wrong. It may also be like Oregon or Washington State. But they claim to have found the perfect cow, so I'm sure that wherever this cow is, the Temple Institute has agents literally there standing guard around this cow, making sure nobody puts a yoke on it, nobody brands it, nobody feeds it a strip of bacon or anything like that, and making sure, of course, that nobody comes and desecrates their sacred cow. It could, however, turn out to be a very negative event for the world, because if they attempt to rebuild the temple, at the very least, you would see tensions between the Palestinians and the Israelis reach a new height. There would be massive riots, there would be a massive amount of bloodshed, at least locally, which is certainly not something that the world needs. And then then you can go beyond and say that these Shia nations especially, and especially the Iranians, believe very literally that Dajjal is going to come walking down the street one day and attempt to do this. It could lead to a large-scale fight in this region, and possibly millions of deaths. Not because it's actually a real event, not because the Antichrist is literally coming or anything like that, but because these people believe that it is. They've created a self-fulfilling end-times prophecy almost, by virtue of their belief systems clashing so directly. They've actually set the world up for some future cataclysm, at least within the Middle Eastern region, because there are nuclear weapons there, because they do dichotomously oppose one another's religions to such an extent that they believe that in the future it may be necessary to wipe the other side out to preserve themselves. That goes for Islam, Judaism, and Christianity as well, which might explain why the area is so unstable. These people can't possibly get along. You have infights within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as well. These people have been fighting for many centuries, in some cases thousands of years. If the red heifer is offered, then the end times might not come because there's actually a God willing it to happen, but because there's a nuclear war or something. That's not an exaggeration when you consider how many people within these religions take these things seriously, including, by the way, people who potentially are in politics, in upper ranks of military, in large businesses, corporations. in things like that, who have sway over public opinion, number one, and who have potential control over weapons systems, number two. And we've already pumped this area full of weaponry already. So you could see a very bad scenario emerge. Very, very bad if this heifer is offered, again, not because of some god's will, but simply because people believe in it enough to potentially butcher one another for their belief systems. So hopefully it falls in a ditch and gets some blemishes on it or something, and they never rebuild the temple. Although, who knows, they might just take some regular brown cow and spray paint it a reddish brown color, say, fuck it, we're just going to offer this, and then curse themselves, and then Satan comes out of a hole and destroys the world. I don't know, maybe I should be agnostic on these topics, but that would be weak compared to what man can do to himself because of these crazy religious beliefs. Not crazy as in, well, you believe in a god, that's a horrible thing. I don't care if people believe in a god. When they start to butcher one another and look at each other suspiciously and say, well, we're going to take over the world because the Messiah is coming or something, that's, I would argue, at least subjectively a negative belief, and I think a lot of people would think the same way. That's about all.